And welcome back to the second installment in our second Downbelow RPG developer discussion series. I'm Steve.
I'm Ian.
And together we are developing a narrative-driven neo-cyberpunk RPG that doesn't use dice.
It is set in a dystopian world, but in this series we are talking more about the game system than the world. We will do a series later on the world, but you need to know how to play.
Besides, if you know how to play, you can apply this to a world of your own, and we are free, once we get the basics down, to develop other worlds. And personally, I find that I've got way more fun designing worlds, characters, and plots than I do designing systems. But that's just me.
And if you've got a really good system that doesn't get in the way and helps you to get a story told with a group of people as a game, then that can be helpful in your creating of worlds and characters.
So we talked about systems not getting in the way, and we also talked about the possibility of using this for multiple things. So here's the thing. Narratively speaking, it does not matter whether you're shooting a bad guy with a minigun, a laser beam, or a bow and arrow. The end result is that you are good at shooting that thing or bad at shooting that thing, and the bad guy is taken out of the way. More on that later. Today we're going to talk about characters, how they look like, and what they do.
So the only reason that it matters to your character, whether you're using a minigun, a laser gun, or a bow and arrow, is what your character's good at.
Yep.
If your character has a trait on their character sheet saying that they have modern military training, then both laser guns and miniguns might well fall under that trait. Bows and arrows? Maybe not.
Yeah, not as much. While it's not inconceivable for someone to have such training, it's not really standardized in most modern militaries. Each player character should have, in the basic game, 10 positive traits. Now, this is a hard and fast number. This isn't a hard and fast number. I got ahead of myself there. 10 is a number we've chosen because, as we'll talk about in scene construction in a later installment, look for it in 1 or 2 videos from now, 10 leads to a nice rounded number of successes and failures in any given scene. Each trait the character has can generate 1 success during the story, or rather during the game session. Each trait can be recharged by accepting a failure. Usually the failure will be related to a linked trait, but not always.
Generally speaking, the GM can allow players to recharge any used up trait when they actually accept a narrative failure. Which means that in the course of a game session, as long as the players are willing to accept failure before the very end, they actually get to succeed far more than 10 times, as long as they're willing to accept a few lumps along the way.
Right now we're not talking about what success and failure means narratively, though. We're talking about what does it look like on a character sheet. I mentioned that there are 10 traits. There are 2 basic ways that a character can have their traits generated.
You can either write the character's identity down narratively as a set of story sentences, like where they went to college and what they studied, or you can do it the other way around.
If you write the traits down, what you'd do is you'd pick 10 things out of the story, out of the background, highlight, bold, or otherwise pick them out, and voila, those are your 10 traits.
Otherwise, you could just write those descriptive traits, like good at shooting, good at running, and then figure out why.
Some people like to do it both ways. In some of the sample games we've run, we've seen people write 1 or 2 sentences, pick 3 or 4 things out of that, and then say, and by the way, James Bond is also good at bluffing, shooting, driving cars, and gambling. This is really it. That's all it takes to make a character.
Now, since we're talking about putting stuff on your character sheet, we should talk about whether you ever get to put more stuff on your character sheet, because most RPGs allow you to advance your character, and we don't think that's always necessary for this game, because, as mentioned, you get to do your stuff again after you have failed. However, some people might want to have the characters get more badass, or at least feel like they're getting more badass as the story goes on, and in that case, it should basically be a bonus for completing a significant story objective, and then allow people to straight up add a trait to their character sheet.
Now, there's a couple of precedents to this in both directions, and there's also a third option that I'm going to talk about at the end of this digression. Let's look at James Bond. There's two very different James Bonds. There's book James Bond and movie James Bond.
Not even going into the variations among different actors playing him.
Actually, the variations among different actors playing them is the third option. So that was a very prescient remark. The first option is book James Bond. Book James Bond remains very similar, except that Ian Fleming, and then later on ghostwriters who would pick up the mantle after Fleming died, slowly added a few more characteristics to his sheet. Original James Bond in the first series of novels is your basic Cold War secret agent. While he's capable of doing pretty much all the things that Fleming himself did, he fits very neatly into the box. Eventually, he gets one or two things added. As the times move and as Fleming realized that there were more technologies out there and more knowledges for Bond to pick up, he started getting a little bit broader than suave McShootman, and developed more interests and became generally a better rounded character. Over the course of over 20 years, James Bond probably added about 3 traits to his character sheet. Then we go to the movie James Bond. Movie James Bond, if you look at any given actor's run on the series, remains largely the same from start to finish. If you look at Sean Connery's James Bond, the only thing that really changes is which gadgets does the quartermaster department give him this time, and really what information does he have from the villains that have recurred from earlier in the series. Information is not a trait. Information is just a resource the player has access to. The movie James Bond doesn't really change, and yet doesn't really get boring as a character, at least during the run of any given actor. Some people get tired of James Bond always being the same, but that actually leads us to the third option.
Option 3, you could switch actors. Well,
exactly.
In this game, what that means is actually something different. If you feel like it would be better for your character to be good at something different, like you haven't used your driving skill in ages because the stories never involve using a car. Also, your car keeps getting blown up before you can even get in it. Then you might ask to change that trait out because you have been learning a new skill and you don't use the driving skill.
It doesn't mean your character magically forgets how to drive. It just means that since that's not a focus, you get rusty. It stops being a thing you can use as a built-in success. And we'll talk about successes from stuff in a little bit as well.
We'll talk about that when we're talking about scene planning, but just
Exactly.
remember, if players have appropriate stuff, all characters effectively have the built-in trait, right tool for the job that they can use once per session, and they can recharge that with failure just like any other trait.
Now, we've been talking entirely about player characters here. You might notice we haven't talked a thing about non-player characters.
Non-player characters don't look the same as player characters at all.
Non-player characters effectively have, they have a variable number of stats as well, but their stats look like this. Here is a bar. No, here is the bar. This bar is how much of any given sort of resource the non-player character has, and as the player characters get successes, the resource is depleted. They have one such bar for each story-relevant resource they possess.
So that story-relevant resource might be willingness to do thing X.
It might be amount of punishment they can take.
And it might be amount of money that they are willing to lose or able to lose.
It might even be amount of patience they have for this whole silly thing.
There's all sorts of things, but basically NPCs look like a series of challenges. NPCs look like a lock, and player characters' traits look like a key. NPCs look like the GM's back end on the game because they are functionally indistinguishable from any other form of challenge the way that GMs design them. Whether it is specifically about how awesome your gang boss is, or whether it's more about how impenetrable the bureaucracy of this particular embassy, whatever, that actually matters more based on what the players choose to do in the session, whereas as a GM, you might not be designing specific characters as your NPCs necessarily with traits, because you might have to deal with players who go in lots of different directions, but have to use the same scene planning for all of them.
Yeah, and this also, before I sign off, this has precedent for earlier RPG development as well. It's not until the 80s that monsters started getting statistics. In early editions of Dungeons & Dragons, and honestly in early editions of a lot of games, monsters just had the stats of, this is how hard it hits, these are its special moves, this is how many hit points it can take. It's not until people started realizing that they can have things that affect monsters directly, or that monsters could be used as player characters, that they started getting actual fleshed-out character sheets of their own.
So, we are out of time, and we'll talk about more things in the next installment, but thanks for falling through the cracks with us.